It's February 20th, 1521, and another remarkable event is about to be uncovered by Arion, Rebecca, and Olly, the Retrospectors.
So it was today in history in 1521 that the Spanish explorer Juan Ponce de León departed Puerto Rico on his second expedition to Florida, accompanied by 2 ships and around 200 people. And he landed near what is now Charlotte Harbour with the intention of setting up a new colony, but just 2 months later, slight spoilers, he was dead.
The end. See you tomorrow. Yes. Well, even Ponce de Leon's first trip to Florida previously that you mentioned may not have been the first time that Florida had been sighted. There are reports that when he first disembarked then, he was greeted by Indians speaking Spanish. So they'd actually met Europeans before, and Portuguese navigators went via Florida, and the Cabots sailing from England went via Florida as well. It started appearing on maps, the sort of distinctive peninsular shape of Florida, by 1510. So it's not as if people in Europe didn't have some concept that there was a landmass there. They just hadn't properly, definitively attempted to colonise it before, partly because it's swampland. I mean, it's been the sort of history of Floridian colonisation, isn't it? People weren't sure they wanted to be there, but it was obviously of strategic benefit to try.
Yeah, and the reason that it fell to Ponce de León to be the one to lead these expeditions was a result of a power struggle, really. He had emerged as one of the prominent conquistadors. He'd sailed with Columbus's second voyage to the Americas at the age of 19 in 1493, and he had emerged as a leading figure in the colonization of Hispaniola, which is the large Caribbean island which is now divided between the Dominican Republic and Haiti, including the brutal subjugation of the native Taino people. He was infamous for having a savage attack dog called Becerrillo, Little Bull Calf, who is said to have mauled dozens of people to death and came to be regarded almost as a supernatural figure. As a result of all this brutality, he eventually ended up as the first governor of Puerto Rico. The problem is that he had a rival, and the rival happened to be Columbus's son, Diego. Diego managed to successfully oust him. Ponce de León went to the Spanish king, Ferdinand, was obviously upset, and sensing that this was going to be a bit of a problem and that maybe there were just too many cooks in Puerto Rico at this point, he then basically gave Ponce de León a charter to say, why don't you go away from Puerto Rico and explore some of the more unknown things northwards, and anything you find there, you can be the governor of.
Yeah, so encouraged as he was by the Spanish crown to discover more lands, Ponce de León allegedly decided to follow rumours he had heard from local natives about an island called Bimini, which was, according to rumour again, home to a magical spring or fountain whose waters would rejuvenate those who drank from it. And so in the search for this fountain of youth, as well as more land and more gold, that was the main thing that he was after, he set sail from Puerto Rico in March 1513. And the next month, the expedition landed on the coast of what's now Florida, near the site of modern-day St. Augustine. And when he landed on the coast of mainland North America, Ponce de León named the site Florida, not only because they had landed around the time of Easter, which is Pascua Florida in Spanish, but also because of the region's very lush, florid vegetation. And on that point, by the way, for political reasons, Spain would, over the years ahead, sometimes claim that La Florida was all of the North American continent. So they were like, no, we weren't just claiming one little chunk of it. Everything that was on that piece of land was ours.
Okay, you mentioned the Fountain of Youth thing, so let's just go on to that for a second. Because if you ask modern-day Americans who was Ponce de León, the thing they know is the Fountain of Youth, mostly because they're taken there as a tourist attraction when they're kids by their school. And it's a thing in Florida where you can still fill up a glass of dirty water and pretend that you're going to have eternal life. And it's sulfurous, basically. It tastes a bit of eggs. So, for a 7-year-old, it sticks in your brain. That is written in some texts in exactly the way you just delivered it, Arion, that León was seeking the Fountain of Youth. But it's worth mentioning that the first recorded writing of this allegation was in satire. So there was a satirical writer who was a contemporary of de León and didn't like him very much, wrote a story about him being deceived by Indians to go and find the wellspring of eternal youth, which probably was just to show that he was gullible and easily manipulated. It was a plot device for satire. However, that legend then got put into print by Washington Irving, that lots of American school children over generations went on to read. And it's a nicer part of the story, isn't it, than here's a man who took his his bulldog to fight the indigenous people and attempt to take the state, and then they shot him. It's a more palatable story that he was a sort of Don Quixote type adventurer.
Well, and to be fair, by the time of the expedition we're talking about in 1521, he probably was more at a good age to discover the Fountain of Youth. He was somewhere between 47 and 61, depending on what accounts you believe, and it was kind of an old age to be heading back into this uncharted territory. But the problem was that by then, King Ferdinand, who had kind of been his benefactor, they were very pally, he had died, and rival explorers had started launching expeditions to Florida. And bear in mind that he'd been told he could be the governor of this colony if he was able to establish it. So he knew he needed to return. So he decided to go one better than his rivals. He announced an intention to establish a settlement in this new territory. He wrote to the new King Carlos, boasting that he intended to cultivate the land and spread the word of Jesus Christ among the native population, which in retrospect was a wildly ambitious plan, given that those European visitors who had gone to Florida since his first voyage had barely been able to set foot on the mainland without coming under attack. That was because the local people, the Calusa, were a fishing culture, so they were based along the coastlines, and they were thus very quick to see and engage with potential invaders. So any recce's of the land had to be very fast. But De Leon didn't seem too concerned about this at the time. Subsequent explorers had escaped at least with their lives, so maybe he thought the hostility he had seen firsthand was just bad luck. And there was also the lure of gold, because some of those recent expeditions, conquistadors had been given pieces of silver and gold by the natives, which sparked these dreams that there were untapped riches. But ironically, it would later turn out that the pieces had washed ashore from Spanish shipwrecks and simply been picked up on the beach by the local people.
And so in 1521, Ponce de Leon was on his mission back here. This time he had his 200 people, plus he had horses, tools and seeds. So I guess he was, hedging his bets, imagining that he might be able to set up a colony in spite of the obvious antagonism that was likely to come his way. They landed on the southwest coast of Florida and they started work on building this colony. The exact circumstances of what happened next are a bit uncertain, but it appears that in July of 1521, some indigenous people attacked the party of settlers, leaving Ponce de Leon fatally wounded by what is now thought to have been a poisoned arrow in his thigh. His comrades then sailed back with him to Havana, Cuba, which is where he died.
And as far as deaths go, it would have been one that you really didn't want, because, as you mentioned, the local Calusa people were known for dipping the tips of their arrows in the extremely poisonous sap of the manchineel tree. I cannot overstate how poisonous this tree is. It grows small green fruit, and eating it can cause violent gastroenteritis and anaphylaxis. Even being dripped on by its leaves in a rainstorm can result in blistering, and burning the wood of the tree can damage your eyes. One French visitor to Hispaniola would record how, after using a branch unknowingly to fan away mosquitoes, quote, "All my face swelled the next day and filled with blisters, as if burnt to such a degree that I was blind for 3 days." The Spanish would come to call the tree Manzanilla de la Muerte, little apple of death. So with this in mind, you can imagine exactly how De Leon was when one of these arrows sank into his leg.
Yeah, so he was buried in Puerto Rico in the crypt of the San Jose Church. His remains were then exhumed and transferred to the Cathedral of San Juan Bautista, and inscribed on the side panel of the altar tomb was this phrase in Latin: "Under this structure rest the bones of a lion, more for his great deeds than for his name." It's quite funny that they thought necessary to spell that out. They were like, okay, yeah, he was called De Leon, but also he was a bit of a lion, you guys.
Meantime, news reached Spain that Florida wasn't worth exploring because it was too dangerous, and the king banned further expeditions for a while. One royal report pointed out Florida was, quote, "too poor in resources and her harbours too barred and shallow to permit practicable settlement." They didn't mention the poisonous tree. But then, in 1565, Spanish spies discovered that France had established a settlement near present-day Jacksonville. And so at that point, Philip II sends across a Spaniard again, Pedro Menendez, basically to massacre the French and found what came to be St. Augustine.
But nonetheless, Spain never quite figured out how to make a go of this swampy, malarial hinterland. It was populated by very hostile indigenous peoples, full of deadly diseases. Basically, Florida came to be a necessary filler between New Spain, which was Mexico and a lot of what's now the southwest USA, and the Spanish Caribbean. They weren't quite sure what to do with it, and their hold over Florida was largely hypothetical beyond St. Augustine. It was based on a handful of forts and isolated missions, and the whole thing basically fell apart like a house of cards when it came under the slightest pressure from the expanding British and French colonies.
It's funny, isn't it, when you think about what Florida is now, that Florida would ever be a possession you'd have basically just as Coast Guard. Like, really, the Spanish only wanted it because it was a lookout point for their other territorial possessions, which were more important to them. Their ships were on the way to New Spain, and they needed someone there to make sure they weren't going to be the victim of piracy.
Well, the Spanish Empire didn't have a lot of elderly Jewish retirees.
And so another week of retrospecting ends. But next week begins a day early at CLUB RETROSPECTORS. Join us now to get an exclusive episode every Sunday. Patreon.com/retrospectors.